Story number one. I never used to think twice about driving through wooded areas at dusk. Growing up in Maryland meant countless trips through tree-lined highways, and the most I'd ever worried about was the occasional deer. That changed after what we saw on our way back from Warped Tour that summer. The festival had left us exhausted but happy as we headed home through Maryland. Sarah's mom drove while we dozed in the back of the minivan, the setting sun painting long shadows through the trees that lined both sides of Highway 295. The air conditioning hummed quietly, mixing with the soft music from the radio, and the rhythmic motion of the van had nearly lulled me to sleep. The relative quiet of our drive was about to be shattered by something none of us could explain. I noticed it first, mainly because I was fighting sleep by watching the opposite lanes through heavy-lidded eyes. The initial movement caught my attention, not wind through leaves or a deer's cautious emergence, but a deliberate, wrong parting of branches. The foliage shuddered and twisted unnaturally, as if something large was pushing through from behind. What stepped out made my breath catch in my throat. The creature stood upright on two impossibly long back legs, its body covered in what looked like wet, stringy black hair that hung in matted clumps. In the fading daylight, the hair seemed to absorb the remaining sunlight rather than reflect it, creating a void-like silhouette against the greenery. Its proportions were distorted, limbs extended far beyond any natural length, joints bending at angles that defied anatomy. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall when fully upright, though it kept changing its posture in quick, jerking motions. As it began to move, my stomach churned violently. The thing didn't run or walk or bound. It propelled itself in a grotesque gallop that seemed to mock natural movement. Each leap launched from its back legs with artificial precision, covering impossible distances before landing again on those same haunches. The motion was mechanical, studied, like something attempting to replicate normal animal locomotion, but fundamentally misunderstanding the physics involved. Its front limbs swayed uselessly with each bound, like pendulums keeping time to some alien rhythm. "Look out!" I screamed as it reached the median. Sarah's mom slammed the brakes, throwing us all forward against our seatbelts. The van's headlights caught the creature mid-jump, illuminating details I wish I hadn't seen. Its body was gaunt and angular, with front limbs that dangled almost to the ground. The stringy hair didn't just cover its body, it writhed independently, like black seaweed in a current. But worse was its face, or where a face should have been. In the harsh glare of our headlights, there was only a smooth, featureless surface, as if someone had stretched dark fabric over a mannequin head. The skin, if you could call it that, had an oily sheen that caught the light in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at. The van's tires screeched as we skidded, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. Emma started screaming in the seat next to me, and I realized I was gripping the headrest so hard my knuckles had gone white. With that same mechanical precision, the creature bounded across our lane in 3 identical leaps. Each movement was an exact replica of the last, down to the angle of its limbs and the way its hair swayed, like watching the same video clip played 3 times in succession. Even the way its feet touched the asphalt was identical each time, creating a rhythmic tap-tap-tap that seemed to echo louder than should have been possible. It disappeared into the trees on our side of the highway, branches snapping in its wake. The sound of its passage continued far longer than it should have, maintaining the same rhythmic pattern until it finally faded into the growing darkness. The crushed vegetation where it had entered the tree line seemed to wilt and darken before our eyes, as if something in its passing had drained the life from the plants themselves. "What the fuck was that?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper from the front seat. Nobody answered. We sat there, engine idling, all of us staring at the spot where it had vanished. The setting sun suddenly seemed much lower, the shadows between the trees much deeper. The air in the van had grown inexplicably cold. Did everyone else see that?" Sarah's mom asked, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. We all nodded silently, still processing what we'd witnessed. A car horn blared behind us, making us all jump. Sarah's mom eased off the brake, and we started moving again. To this day, none of us can explain what we saw on that highway, but we all remember the precise, artificial way it moved, like something wearing nature as an ill-fitting costume. Story number 2. Some people call Lake Okeechobee the inland sea of Florida. On a moonless night, when you're far enough from shore, that vast darkness swallows everything except what your lights can touch. The lake transforms after sunset, becoming a black mirror that reflects nothing but your own anxieties back at you. I used to find that isolation peaceful, back before that night in 2003. We were out catfishing on my friend Tommy's dad's pontoon houseboat, the kind of vessel that was more floating cabin than speedboat. The steady drone of the generator powered our deck lights, creating a small island of visibility in the darkness. The night had been good to us. Our cooler was half full of channel cats, and the gentle lapping of water against the hull had lulled Mr. Parker to sleep hours ago. The rest of us, me, my brother Steve, and Tommy, were still working our lines, speaking in low voices about nothing in particular as the digital clock on the dash blinked past 2 a.m. The exhaustion finally caught up with me. I handed my rod to Steve and headed into the cabin, stepping carefully around the tackle boxes and bait containers that littered the deck. The cabin air was thick with the smell of coffee and fish, mingling with the musty scent of old life jackets and weathered cushions. I dropped onto one of the narrow bunks, the vinyl creaking under my weight. The gentle rocking of the boat had nearly carried me off when I heard urgent whispers from outside. Matt, get out here!" Steve's voice had an edge I'd never heard before, a tension that cut through my near sleep like a knife. I found them at the starboard rail, both pointing westward across the dark water. Their fishing rods lay forgotten on the deck, lines going slack in the water. The surface of the lake stretched out before us, unnaturally calm despite the usual evening breeze. At first, I saw nothing but the usual blackness of the lake at night. Then I noticed it, a sphere of orange light about the size of a basketball from our perspective, hanging motionless above the water maybe half a mile out. "How long is it?" I started to ask, but Tommy cut me off with a sharp gesture. His hand trembled as he pointed. The light began to move, not like any aircraft I'd ever seen. It swayed side to side in perfect arcs, as if suspended from an invisible pendulum. The motion was hypnotic, methodical, almost deliberate. Small waves began forming beneath it, moving against the natural current of the lake. As we watched, the orange glow shifted to a deep electric blue that reflected off the water's surface, creating a column of light that seemed to connect the sphere to the lake below. The water within that column appeared to bend and distort, like we were viewing it through warped glass. The temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath began fogging in the air, despite the Florida summer heat. The surface of the lake grew absolutely still, the usual ripples and waves disappearing as if the water had turned to glass. Even the chorus of frogs and insects that had been our constant companion fell silent. The generator's hum seemed to deepen, its pitch dropping until it matched some subsonic frequency that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. The sphere's color shifted again, this time to an acidic green that hurt my eyes to look at. Its movement changed too. Now it traced perfect geometric patterns in the air, moving in sharp right angles that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Each turn was precise, mechanical, like something following an invisible grid in the sky. The water beneath it began to swirl, not like normal currents, but in exact circular patterns that spread outward like ripples in reverse. Small fish began breaking the surface, their silver bodies catching the unnatural light as they jumped in perfect synchronization. Tommy gripped the rail, his knuckles white. "What the hell is—" The sphere froze mid-motion. The green light pulsed once, twice, and then the object shot across the water toward us faster than anything I'd ever seen. In the split second before we dove for cover, I saw its reflection on the glass-smooth lake surface. Except the reflection showed something different, something with angles and edges that didn't match the simple sphere above. The water itself seemed to bend around it, creating impossible geometries in the reflected light. We hit the deck as a wave of cold air washed over the boat, bringing with it a metallic taste and the sharp scent of ozone. When we looked up again, the light was gone. The natural sounds of the lake rushed back in like someone had turned up the volume, and the water resumed its gentle motion against the hull. But something was different. Our fishing lines, which had been hanging straight down into the water, now pointed west at a 45-degree angle, as if caught in a current that didn't match the lake's natural movement. The generator sputtered and coughed before returning to its normal rhythm. Mr. Parker found us in the cabin an hour later, huddled together in silence. The fish we'd caught earlier were dead in the live well, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, eyes clouded over with a strange, luminescent film. We never did tell him the whole story. How could we? But he must have sensed something was wrong, because he didn't question why we pulled up anchor before dawn, or why we left our rods on the deck. Lines still pointing west against the current. Story number 3. Working late nights delivering pizzas in the mid-90s, you get used to the rhythm of empty roads, radio static, yellow street lights, the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. After a while, even the darkness between towns becomes familiar territory. You learn every curve, every pothole, every spot where deer might dart out from the tree line. I was heading back to the store after a delivery one winter evening in 1996, about a week before the Super Bowl. The night was clear enough to see stars and the highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the cold January sky. The heater in my old Civic struggled against the chill, forcing me to keep my winter coat on while I drove. My mind was already on my next delivery when I noticed the lights. 3 of them hung above the horizon, impossibly bright against the backdrop of stars. They were arranged almost in a perfect line, steady and unwavering, each one a brilliant white gold that made the surrounding stars look dim in comparison. My first thought was aircraft. We had a small regional airport nearby, and planes often lined up for landing in that direction. But something about these lights made my skin prickle. They were too bright, too fixed in position. Even accounting for the parallax effect of driving down the highway, they shouldn't have appeared that stationary. Each light seemed to pulse slightly, not like a blinking aircraft signal, but like something breathing. I kept glancing between the road and the lights, trying to convince myself I was seeing something ordinary. Maybe military aircraft doing exercises, or some kind of new landing procedure at the airport. The radio played quietly, some late-night talk show about football predictions, while I watched the center light begin to move. My fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel, leaving cold sweat marks on the worn leather. It rose slowly at first, so gradually I thought I was imagining it. But as I continued down the empty highway, the movement became undeniable. The center light drifted upward with deliberate precision until the 3 points formed a perfect equilateral triangle. The geometry was too exact, too artificial. No aircraft formation could maintain that level of precision. The space between the lights seemed darker than the surrounding sky, as if the triangle enclosed a piece of deeper night. Then the entire configuration began to ascend as one unit. The movement was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Smooth, controlled, completely silent. The triangle of lights rose higher and higher, maintaining its perfect shape, until it cleared the tree line completely. There was something almost mechanical about its motion, like watching the hands of a clock move. Inexorable, measured, precise. The surrounding air seemed to bend slightly, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But this was a January night. I found myself slowing down, my foot easing off the gas pedal without conscious thought. The few other cars on the highway seemed oblivious, their headlights sweeping past as the triangle continued its ascent. The radio signal began to deteriorate, the football discussion dissolving into static that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. The car's electrical system seemed affected too. My headlights dimmed slightly, and the dashboard lights flickered in an odd pattern. The dashboard clock read 11:42 when the lights started to fade. Not like something moving away, but like something deliberately dimming itself. The perfect triangle maintained its shape until the very end, growing fainter and fainter until it merged with the darkness above. When I finally lost sight of it behind a row of bare winter trees, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The temperature gauge on my dashboard had dropped 10 degrees without the heater changing settings. Back at the pizza shop, I said nothing. The fluorescent lights and smell of oregano seemed absurd after what I'd witnessed. My manager complained about me being late, but I couldn't explain that I'd lost time somewhere between the last delivery and the store. According to the wall clock, my 20-minute return trip had somehow taken 45 minutes. I took my next delivery and tried to forget about it. But a week later, I was half watching the Sci-Fi Channel before the Super Bowl when a UFO documentary came on. When they showed the video clips of triangular formations, my pizza nearly fell from my hand. There it was, the exact same configuration, the same mechanical precision in its movement. The radio in my car never quite worked right after that night. Sometimes when I hit certain spots on that stretch of highway, the static would return, pulsing in that same steady rhythm. The heater would flutter too, cycling between hot and cold regardless of its setting. I delivered pizzas for another year, but I always took the back roads when they were available, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the yellow lines ahead. Story number 4. The human mind tries to forget impossible things, but its image is burned into my memory, as solid as the stone it seemed to be carved from. That night started like any other at the data center. The steady hum of server fans, the soft glow of monitor arrays, and the occasional beep of a UPS system created their usual symphony of technology. By 2 a.m., I'd finished updating the last network configuration, my eyes burning from staring at command lines all night. I stepped out of the data center, keys jingling as I played dodge the puddles to my car. The steady hum of server rooms still rang in my ears, making the outside world feel strangely muted. By some miracle, the rain stopped just as I pulled into my driveway in Allen. The clouds hung low and heavy, their undersides painted orange by streetlights. The air felt wrong, too dense, like the moment before a transformer blows. My phone buzzed, Marcus calling about the server migration we'd been wrestling with all week. I lit a cigarette, letting the familiar ritual steady my hands as I described the night system hiccups to Marcus. The wind picked up, pushing waves through the cloud ceiling. That's when I saw it emerging from the north. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. A perfect geometric shape, moving with impossible precision through the night sky. A cube, massive and black, rotating corner first as it cut through the air. The surface looked like volcanic stone, each face at least 80 feet across, but with a texture that made my eyes hurt trying to focus on it. It wasn't reflecting light like it should. Instead, the orange glow from the street lamps seemed to bend and vanish into its surface. The clouds above parted as it approached, not like wind pushing them aside, but as if they were being systematically divided. The gap formed a perfect square, its edges sharp and unnatural. Water vapor within the gap condensed into geometric patterns, creating brief, crystalline structures that hung in the air before dissolving. The cube maintained a constant speed, maybe 60, 70 miles per hour, on a direct path towards 75 Central Expressway. No sound, no lights. Just this monumental shape sliding through reality like a blade. The air behind it twisted into spiraling vortexes that rotated in alternating directions before dissolving into nothing. Each vortex formed at exact 45-degree angles to the cube's trajectory, creating a symmetrical pattern that defied natural air movement. My cigarette had burned down to my fingers, unnoticed. "Marcus," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. "There's something..." I couldn't find words to describe what I was seeing. The cube was rotating slightly as it moved, revealing more of its surface. Each edge where the faces met was carved with repeating patterns that seemed to shift and change, defying geometry. On one face within a raised border was a circular symbol. It reminded me of a maze seen from above, but the design writhed and flowed like a living thing. The longer I stared at it, the more complex it became, revealing layers of meaning that felt like they were trying to rewrite something in my brain. The temperature dropped suddenly, not gradually but in distinct increments, like digital clicks downward. I could see my breath forming strange patterns in the air, mimicking those spinning vortexes behind the craft. The moisture in my exhaled breath crystallized momentarily before evaporating, forming the same geometric shapes I'd seen in the clouds above. My ears popped as the atmospheric pressure fluctuated in waves that matched the cube's rotation. As it passed almost directly overhead, my skin began to tingle with static electricity. The streetlights dimmed and flickered in sequence, each one darkening as the cube passed over and taking several seconds to return to full brightness. The asphalt seemed to vibrate beneath my feet, though there wasn't a sound I could actually hear. "Get outside," I told Marcus, who lived a few miles south. "Look north. You can't miss it." While I stammered directions, My phone's screen began to flicker and distort. The cube was directly in line with his neighborhood now, maintaining that same precise trajectory. Marcus stood in his street for 20 minutes as the rain started again, but he never saw it. The cube had vanished somewhere over Dallas, taking with it all my certainty about the world. When I finally went inside, every digital display in my house was blinking 1200, and my ears rang with a frequency I'd never heard before. The next day at work, I pulled up the weather radar from the night before. Between 2:17 a.m. and 2:19 a.m., there's a perfect square-shaped void in the data moving south over Allen. The National Weather Service blamed it on equipment malfunction. They said the same thing about the cube-shaped hole that appeared in the low cloud cover, captured by a weather satellite passing overhead at precisely 2:18 a.m. Story number 5. Nothing good ever comes from sitting in an Indiana cornfield after midnight. But back in '97, that's where you'd find us after closing shifts. That night, the rye field stretched out like a black ocean around my Civic, stalks rustling in a wind too gentle to hear. The darkness was absolute except for my dashboard lights and the blanket of stars above. Half a mile off the main road, we could spot approaching cars from forever away. Their headlights would trace long arcs across the horizon as they followed the country roads. Mike was in the passenger seat, methodically breaking up some brickweed on a CD case, when I caught a flash in my rearview mirror. 2 bright points of light, like high beams, swept in from behind us, made an impossible left turn, and vanished. "Did you see?" I started, but Mike just snorted, focused on his task. My eyes darted between the mirrors, scanning for police lights or approaching vehicles, but the field remained empty. That's when I noticed the star. It wasn't remarkable at first, just one point of light among thousands. But something about it felt wrong, like when you spot a spider in your peripheral vision. As I watched, it began to move. Not the slow drift of satellites or planes, but deliberate patterns. Up, down, side to side, perfect circles. Each movement fluid yet precise, like a cursor on a screen. The edges of the light remained perfectly sharp, never blurring or streaking despite its rapid changes in direction. "What the fuck is that?" The panic in my voice finally made Mike look up. He sighed, clearly annoyed at the interruption, until he followed my trembling finger skyward. The object danced overhead for 5 endless minutes, tracing impossible geometries through the stars. No sound reached us but the whisper of rye stalks. The light remained constant, not pulsing or flaring, just that same unwavering brightness as it carved patterns into the night sky. Stars seemed to dim slightly whenever the object passed in front of them, as if it was somehow affecting their light. Then it divided. One became 5 identical points of light, each as bright as the original. The split happened instantaneously with no trace of movement between singular and multiple states. They moved in formation at first, creating geometric shapes that shifted and flowed into each other. Triangles becoming squares, becoming pentagons, each transformation mathematically perfect. Then they broke pattern, each light moving independently but somehow coordinated, like fingers on a hand making increasingly complex gestures. The spaces between them seemed darker than the surrounding sky. Just as my brain began to process what I was seeing, the 5 lights snapped back together, fusing into a single point with mathematical precision. The silence felt heavier now, pressing down on us through the windshield. Mike's hands had frozen over his forgotten task, the crumbled weeds scattered across his lap. We started talking, voices low and shaky, trying to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. The light remained above us, moving subtly now, as if waiting. Then, without warning, it divided again, this time into 7 distinct points. The new configuration moved differently. The lights jerked and snapped through the air, their movements sharp and aggressive. They seemed to be communicating through motion, like an angry conversation in a language of light and geometry. Each trajectory felt charged with purpose. At times, they would freeze completely still for a fraction of a second before resuming their erratic dance, defying any natural form of movement. "We need to go," Mike said, brushing the weed off his pants. "Something's not right." "It's here for us," I blurted out, immediately regretting how crazy it sounded. But I knew it was true. had known since that first impossible movement. This wasn't something we were merely witnessing. We were being observed, studied, maybe even tested. I cranked the engine and threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. The 7 lights moved as one, keeping pace above us as we sped through the rye field. They maintained formation all the way to the outskirts of town, where streetlights began to blur the dark edges of the sky. Only then did they recombine one final time, shooting straight up until they vanished among the true stars. Later analysis would suggest our entire encounter lasted 12 minutes, though neither of us could explain how we came up with that precise figure. The brick weed remained scattered across Mike's passenger seat, untouched. Neither of us ever went back to that field, even in daylight. Story number 6. In 1960s Ethiopia, disappearances weren't uncommon, but they followed rules. The poor vanished into thin air, while the wealthy vanished into politics. The children of the elite, however, simply didn't vanish at all, not with armed guards and 10-foot walls and the eyes of an entire nation watching their every move. Until Gabriel. I was 9 years old when it happened, playing with my best friend in our walled compound in Addis Ababa. As the son of Ethiopia's Minister of Interior, I was used to the constant presence of guards, their shadows moving along the top of the brick walls like clockwork. Gabriel's father was a 4-star general, which meant twice the security when we played together. Our compound was a fortress within a fortress. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the courtyard as we chased each other between the carefully maintained gardens. I remember the exact moment I had turned to retrieve our ball from behind a hedge. 3 seconds. That's how long my back was turned. When I looked back, the courtyard was empty. At first I thought he was hiding. We searched behind every bush, under every bench. The guards searched too, their initial amusement turning to concern as minutes stretched into hours. By sunset, both our families were in chaos. How could a child vanish from within walls topped with armed guards? Every gate had been manned. No one had entered or left. The search expanded beyond our compound. Police went door to door with his description: private school uniform, white shirt, brown pants, son of General Tekle. Military helicopters crisscrossed the countryside. His face appeared on every newspaper, his description broadcast on every radio station. Ethiopia's ruling class doesn't lose its children, until it did. Weeks passed, then months. The searches continued, but hope faded. Some whispered about political enemies, about revenge against the general. Others spoke of darker things, spirits and demons that steal children. My parents watched me constantly, as if I might vanish too. Exactly 6 months later, to the hour, I was in the same courtyard when movement caught my eye. Gabriel stood there, exactly where he'd vanished, wearing the same pristine white shirt and brown pants. They were still pressed clean, as if he'd just put them on that morning. The compound erupted into chaos. Guards rushed in, weapons drawn. Our parents came running. Doctors examined him while security teams searched the compound again. Gabriel appeared perfectly healthy, not a scratch on him, not a single sign of 6 months' passage. When the initial frenzy calmed, the questions began. Gabriel's answers turned our world inside out. He spoke of men who looked European but spoke perfect Amharic, who took him to a room that glowed from within. Other children were there, he said, speaking languages he'd never heard but somehow understood. The walls themselves moved, concealing doors that appeared and disappeared at will. Push a button, and beds emerged from solid surfaces. Push another, and entire worlds opened up. He described a city that shimmered like sunlight on water, where vehicles moved through the air in precise patterns. The people there looked almost human, he said, but with subtle differences that made them uncanny. They took him to a tower where reality bent to imagination. Rooms that could become anything, take you anywhere. A beach, a mountaintop, the stars themselves. To Gabriel, it felt like hours. He spoke of these wonders with a child's enthusiasm, but described them with unsettling precision. The exact patterns of movement in the flying vehicles, the mathematical regularity of the disappearing doors, the specific frequency of the light that emanated from every surface. The adults around us reacted with predictable terror. Priests were summoned, exorcisms were performed. They tried to cast out demons that Gabriel insisted weren't there. But how else could they explain a child who vanishes from a guarded compound and returns 6 months later, unchanged? Speaking of impossible technologies, the incident changed him. While other children played soccer, Gabriel drew diagrams of the rooms he'd seen, filled notebooks with equations trying to explain how the walls could move, how the vehicles could fly. He pursued physics with an intensity that worried his parents but earned him a doctorate decades later. I saw those notebooks. The equations grew more complex as he aged, but they all attempted to explain the same things: the geometry of those moving walls, the physics of those flying vehicles, the mathematics of rooms that could become anything. When I visited him in Holland years later, his office walls were covered with the same equations, still trying to explain what he'd seen that day. Sometimes I wonder if they chose him because they knew what he would become, or if he became what he did because they chose him.